Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues and partners. My name is Madhu Raghunath, and I'm the lead urban specialist at the World Bank. On behalf of the Resilient Cities Network and World Bank, a warm welcome to all of you for joining us at the Cities on the Frontline SpeakerSeries on Aligning Infrastructure for Resilience. The Cities on the Frontline series is a virtual thought leadership speaker series which was started in 2020, co-organized by the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank Group's City Resilience Program. This series provides city practitioners and industries and residents an understanding and means for responding to the pandemic and associated stresses, as well as solutions for planning towards a more resilient recovery. Before I hand off the microphone to Nini to introduce our speakers, I want to remind everyone of the intention and the ground rules for the conversation today. The purpose of these global seminars is to have an open and honest learning conversations between practitioners in cities and governments and partners supporting those entities. These calls are not on record, and we ask that you not attribute any comments made today or questions asked to the speakers unless the materials are made available after the call or you have the person's explicit permission to do so. So let's get started. We're really thrilled at the response to this speaker series, where we have close to 400 people registered for this call globally. To facilitate this discussion, and as a matter of practicality, we ask you, please use the Q&A function to pose the questions. We will also share some polling questions, and they will show up in your screen during the session, and we look forward to your response. So with this, I'll hand it over to my colleague Nini for the introduction of the speakers. Over to you, Nini.
Thank you, Madhu. Hello, I'm Nini Purwajati from Resilient Cities Network, and I have the pleasure to introduce today's topic and the speakers. This is a rare opportunity to have 3 layers of government in Australia working on infrastructure to be in this session. Infrastructure increasingly plays a complex role in supporting resilience, especially with more and more shock and stresses we are facing. Different organizations manage critical infrastructure in our cities and regions. It is important to break the silos between these different layers of governments. There is also the need to shift from the resilience of infrastructure and assets to how infrastructure and assets contribute to the resilience of places, communities, and regions, as well as to better understand interdependencies between them. Something that our speakers today prefer to call as infrastructure for resilience rather than resilient infrastructure. So first, we will hear from Rory Butler, Associate Director at Infrastructure Australia, the nation independent infrastructure advisor. He leads the Sustainability and Resilience Unit of the Policy and Research team. Rory recently authored the Sustainability and Resilience Chapter of the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan, which is a practical and actionable roadmap for infrastructure reform. Second, we will welcome co-presentation from Kieran Handicott and Bob Alam from Infrastructure New South Wales. Kieran is the Executive Director for Infrastructure Strategy at Infrastructure New South Wales. He has 20 years experience across the infrastructure and built environment sectors and has held executive roles responsible for independent assurance of a 50 billion capital portfolio. Also, Kieran has played leading roles in the development of both the 2018 and 2022 state infrastructure strategies. Bopa is the Director of Asset Management at Infrastructure New South Wales. Bopa has played a leading role in the development of the whole of government asset management policy for the New South Wales public sector and designing its assurance process. And then the last presenter is Beck Dawson, Chief Resilience Officer from City of Sydney, who I can say in this today's session is the partner in crime behind designing the session. And I have the pleasure to work together with her for the last few years, including recently around this very topic that we will discuss today. As the CRO, she is leading the Resilient Sydney program and implementation of the first Resilient Sydney strategy, an urban resilient roadmap for metropolitan Sydney, A collaboration project in the strategy involved 33 metropolitan councils and their communities to build local responses to global and city systems challenges from shock and stresses. So now I will hand it over to Rory. The screen is yours.
That introduction, Nini, and I'll just wait for the slides to be shared on your side before starting the presentation. Great, I can see them up on the screen now. So as Nini mentioned, I'm an Associate Director at Infrastructure Australia, and I want to talk you through the national approach to systemic resilience, which we've come up with, from blueprint to plan, and finally to implementation across all levels of government. So next slide, please. So first, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present, emerging of all Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our own IA RAP is celebrated with the artwork Moving Along Pathways by Sydney artist Dennis Golding. Next slide, please. So who are we? Infrastructure Australia is the nation's independent infrastructure advisor, and it's the first of its kind. Other interdependent infrastructure agencies modeled on IA now exist at a state level across the entirety of the country. We collaborate with and hear from government, policymakers, financiers and infrastructure planners and communities, and most importantly, users and taxpayers who often rely on infrastructure for their daily needs. Next slide. Resilience is very much on Australia's radar following the recent floods, fires, and of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. These shocks and stresses are wreaking havoc on communities and economic, social, environmental, and governance outcomes. Natural disasters currently cost our economy $38 billion a year, and that cost is going to rise to $73 billion by 2060, or $94 billion with higher emissions. Most of these costs are inevitably going to be borne by users and taxpayers as governments shift to the insurers of last resort. The map on the right shows where these costs are going to spatially crystallize over the next 40 years. The three main drivers are population growth, climate change, and property value growth. Next slide. So in light of this, it's unsurprising that community resilience is of great concern to governments, communities, and IA. We can't afford to have a repeat of the economic devastation of recent years. Alongside the death, injury, and trauma, the 2019-2020 bushfire season alone is estimated to have cost over $100 billion. Next slide. So infrastructure can play a vital role in supporting economic recovery, but it also comes with tremendous risk. The Australian government has initiated major infrastructure stimulus and rebuilding efforts to combat the effects of COVID-19. Stimulatory investment was committed to accelerate the delivery of roads, water, and other projects. That has in part resulted in historic levels of investment, and the graph in this slide demonstrates that a portion of the infrastructure pipeline for projects over $100 billion in capital costs. Interestingly, mega projects can involve even higher levels of risk. For example, a large Australian energy project over 350 million is more than twice as likely to run over cost than a project under 350 million. So Australia has to navigate this catastrophic cascading set of events in a significant risk environment for project delivery. So to do this, infrastructure needs quite a significant amount of reform. Next slide, please. So the question arises, how do we ensure resilient communities, and what role can communities play in this? Next slide. So in 2020, as a starting point, we gathered 500 stakeholders from industry, academia, and government. We asked them, how do you build community resilience? And we partnered with INSW to synthesize these views and co-produce a paper entitled The Pathway to Infrastructure Resilience. The central finding, as Nina alluded to, was that we need a new systemic approach to resilience. The emergent resilience approach necessitates a shift in focus from resilient infrastructure, that is the sole focus of the resilience of assets themselves, to infrastructure for resilience. That is the contribution of infrastructure assets to the networks and resilience of the system. So systemic resilience asks decision makers to consider the community, place, and network as it exists in. Next slide, please. So the diagram is a reflection of where IA and INSW thinks that change needs to occur in Australia to achieve this systemic resilience. You'll see that the change occurs at 4 levels: a governance and coordination level, a place level, an asset level, and most crucially, a community level. And this is again to get away from that silo view Nina was referring to. Each opportunity is described in full detail in the paper, and each opportunity relies on the other 9 to be successfully executed. So next slide. More specifically, the objectives describe the need to set and monitor resilience outcomes across sectors and jurisdictions, to better utilize scenario modeling, to improve fragmented and uncoordinated and unstandardized data, to better use our land planning, to value resilience better, to share interdependency data before, during, and after shocks and stresses. Finally, and most importantly, at our community level, we consider community trust as the bedrock of all systemic reform, and individuals as their experts of their place and system. So we've achieved a lot of cut through in this work. State infrastructure strategies have adopted the narrative. Valuation of resilience now as a new focus, and our new resilience agency has supported and championed our work. Next slide, please. The next stage was transforming opportunities into recommendations, and we did this through the Australian plan. Next slide. The plan is a positive reform and investment roadmap for Australia, and it was released last year in September. It sets the transformative infrastructure solutions required to drive productivity growth and maintain and enhance Australia's world-class standard of living. It also aims to build community resilience and ensure that our cities and regions both remain world-class. It's the culmination of Infrastructure Australia's 5-year policy cycle, which is informed by 180 challenges and opportunities identified in our 2019 audit, a pathway to resilience paper, as well as a paper on the effects of COVID-19 on the infrastructure sector. Next slide, please. So this is the suite of documents that make up and inform the plan. You'll notice that as well as the vision for reform, we've also compiled an assessment, prioritization, and implementation framework. These gauge the impacts of the reforms using multiple criteria analysis. They embed the quadruple bottom line into our assessment of each reform, and they provide summaries of reform actors, timeframes, and roles. The intent was to hold actors to account and create a clear implementable pipeline. Ultimately, next slide. Ultimately, these are the reforms we settled on for the interconnected sustainability and resilience chapter, which is one of 9 chapters in the audit, which I'll go into further detail in now. So next slide. So the resilience theme transforms a pathway to resilience's opportunities and blueprint into action. It states that national leadership, partnered with clear cross-sectoral policy priorities, should inform resilience planning and prioritization of policy and reform decisions, that systemic change is required at all levels of government, in all sectors and in all communities, that better methods of valuing resilience are required, that risk and resilience assessments should consider the multidimensional nature of challenges, and that effective decision-making needs diverse and inclusive collaboration and data to support credible hazard, disaster, and climate scenario forecasting. On the right side of that slide, you'll see the multiple criteria analysis results, which is a key part of our implementation strategy. It shows that while the reform impacts are high, they're also quite hard to implement due to complexity and government capacity. Next slide, please. So this is our resilience recommendation. So don't squint too hard. Hopefully you'll have the opportunity to read the whole thing after this presentation. But a key part of this challenge was making sure that the plan was measurable and implementable, especially considering the systemic change required at all levels of government. To that end, each reform operates in a hierarchy. It contains a central recommendation in the deep blue box in the top left. It contains outcomes in the bold text below that, and it contains actions to achieve those outcomes below the outcomes. Additionally, each of these levels also contain a time when this reform should impact and a geographic location where the reform's impact will likely crystallize. For each recommendation, outcome, and action, we've named proposed leads as well as supporting agencies. I'm not going to run through the full suite of recommendations due to time constraints, but please explore them at your own leisure. Next slide, please. So my final slide is commenting on the fact that post-release, IA's central challenge is now moving from advice, which is our currency, to implementation. We want government process integration. We want progress reporting. We want to focus on advocacy and priority recommendations, and we want support for change management in government. An essential part of our role as we see it is empowering the plan's change agents. This means helping organizations to understand their role and perform it. It's important because the plan is 650 pages long. It's big, it's detailed, and it's heavy. And some state and territory agencies have hundreds of actions attached to them. So we need to give these change agents tools to know their task within a space of a couple of clicks. So this means sharing an IA-developed facilitation toolkit, which sits on the right-hand side of this slide. These tools develop a shared understanding and ownership of the plan actions and a basis for data collection and reporting. So used in sequence, we believe that these tools will aid those reform actors to putting to sort of navigating the recommendation slide as you saw beforehand, which is quite daunting, and putting that strategy into action to enable a systemic reform to happen across all levels of government. So I'll leave it there, noting that it's just a 10-minute presentation. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, Rory, and you're right on time. So without further ado, over to you, Kieran and Bopa.
And thanks, Rory. Look, before I go on, just as the slides are getting put up, I just pause there while they're getting fired up. But as that's happening, it always speaks for all of us, firstly, by acknowledging the traditional owners of our land, and I also would like to pay respects to our owners, past, present, and emerging. It's really great to be here presenting on behalf of Infrastructure New South Wales with my colleague Beck. We have a similar role to Infrastructure Australia in terms of setting long-term policy and strategy. But the New South Wales government is also a significant asset owner, asset operator, and deliverer of services in our own right. So my colleague Bopa and I will be taking you through this from a resilience context today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a quick run through. We're going to be just giving a little bit of taking stock in context of setting some context of the last 2 years and what we're looking ahead for. We're going to put a little bit of meat on the bones, I guess, in terms of that infrastructure resilience context infrastructure resilience concept to infrastructure for resilience, and giving some examples of that. And then we're going to talk in more detail about the really important focus that we need to have on asset management, which my colleague Bradley is going to touch on in more detail. Next slide, thanks. So as I begin, it's important to do some scene setting in a New South Wales context, take stock of the last 2 years and explore what the future has holds. Here in New South Wales, most of us probably went into the summer of 2019 full of optimism and blissfully ignorant of what was to come over the next couple of years. We had the Black Summer bushfires, which I'm sure a lot of you around the world heard, some of the most significant bushfire events that we've seen in our country, with flooding in Greater Sydney and the central north coast of New South Wales. And then, of course, COVID emerged with lockdown and economic and social shocks. Going into 2021, many of us also probably thought, well, 2021 can't be as bad as 2020. Little did we know that, again, there was very severe flooding in parts of New South Wales and Sydney. COVID and Delta version of COVID emerged. And now going into early 2022, it's also been a traumatic start of the year. We've had more economic and social impacts from Omicron, and just this month we've had some really devastating flooding affecting New South Wales, some historic level flooding that we've had. So what this has meant is that some areas of our state have experienced 3 to 4 natural disasters in this time. And the impacts of these have been compounded by chronic or ongoing stress. The next slide, thanks. So looking ahead, there's a lot at stake. Now, in the coming decades, our changing climate is expected to result in a greater incidence and severity of natural disasters. Our Treasury, the New South Wales Treasury, has estimated that economic costs of these more frequent and more severe disasters will be on average around 16 or $17 billion a year by 2060, and that's in real 2020 dollars. That equates to about 2.5% on average. 2.5% of our gross state product on average, and that's a really significant increase from the events of 2020, which were the bushfires, which had a $5 billion impact, so a threefold increase. The other really, I guess, confronting statistic from their assessment is that they're expecting to have a very significant variability on a year-to-year basis of the impacts, up to potentially $70 billion in any one year, which is more than 10% of our gross state product. And these estimates are consistent with other estimates from industry and the private sector. But it's really important to understand that these impacts are unequal and can often more severely impact the most vulnerable and those with the least adaptive capacity. And we've seen some examples of that recently. The natural disasters such as the bushfires have impacted single economy towns in the state that are reliant on sole industries of tourism and forestry. Some of the most at-risk parts of our state are also some of the most socially disadvantaged. And we've seen that again playing out now with the devastating flooding that's hit the northern regions of New South Wales. And then the pandemic has also starkly illustrated this with some of the social and economic impacts that have occurred exacerbated the existing socio-spatial equality in Sydney and New South Wales. And that's included things like access to green space, access to social services, access to digital delivery of social services as well in areas where the social spatial inequality is more severe. Next slide, please. So working with IA, fundamentally, we recognise that a key shift is needed in the infrastructure context. As Rory said, the research we published in August recognised we need to adopt a systems approach and move from infrastructure resilience to infrastructure for resilience. And what that meant is, as Rory said, strengthening at an asset level alone is insufficient. We also need to consider how we strengthen our system at a network and a place level, strengthen at the community level. And finally, we need to make sure we have the strengthening of the governance and the coordination as a final component. Now, this seems seemingly self-evident, but what we need to understand is that most of our infrastructure ecosystem and how we plan, how we develop, how we deliver infrastructure really tends to focus on an asset by asset or project by project basis. So elevating that up to the systems perspective is quite a formidable challenge. Next slide, please. So we started to take some steps with this in New South Wales, and I wanted to just share an example of the system-wide approach, which is a live project that we're working on at Infrastructure New South Wales. The Hawkesbury European floodplain is an area in the northwest of Sydney, and it's one of the most acute risks to New South Wales from natural disasters. We've been leading an approach with a whole host of government partners where we've kind of taken the systems approach, and I want to kind of talk through that. So as an example, we have infrastructure asset interventions, like the proposed raising of the Warragamba Dam, other physical infrastructure investments such as evacuation roads and bridge raising, are the asset level interventions. But these physical interventions on their own don't adequately protect communities from this. We've had to take a network and place approach to improve the coordination between asset managers and to better understand and prevent place-based risks through land use planning as well. The risk is also reduced when the community aware and can evacuate safe more quickly. This is where that community resilience layer is critical. Building the evacuation routes might be great, but it doesn't mean they'll be used if the community doesn't understand the risk, and therefore the raising of community awareness is critical. And then finally, that organisational level is also vital from a governance and coordination perspective. Improving emergency response, improving recovery, improving the coordination communication before the event means that emergency responders in a better place to respond, to support the evacuation and help foster a speedy recovery and evacuation from the flood affected areas. So I might just flip over to the next slide, thanks. My colleague Brave is going to take it from here largely, but I just wanted to flag that the second part of the suite of work from Minus will be really focused on asset management, and that's a really important but an unsexy but vital component of infrastructure for resilience. New South Wales, for example, has around $400 billion of existing assets and around $200 billion of infrastructure in the pipeline in the next 10 years. Our work, as I said, has highlighted the role of this complaint. Some of the key themes that we've explored during that work and recent work relate to the importance of routine funding and management for asset management activity. It often falls by the wayside for sexier projects. We have to understand the importance of independencies between assets and networks, between different asset classes and different operators. We have to acknowledge the importance of asset renewal. As an example, in New South Wales, the average age of vertical infrastructure assets is about 40 years, designed for a different time, and many are now located in hazard prone locations. Maintenance and planning is also important around tree cleaning, drainage maintenance, around pool evacuation routes, for example, and then digitization and technology, how we embed technology, remote sensing, predictive maintenance, and telco capabilities is also a really important point. I might there hand over to Bopa to take over the next part of the presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Kieran, and hi everyone. It's really great to be here. Nini, if you could just flick over to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in acknowledging the critical role of asset management in resilience, the New South Wales Government introduced the Asset Management Policy in 2020 to address this challenge as well as those from other significant pressures. The state's asset portfolio is growing rapidly, and as Kieran mentioned, the current value is well over $400 billion. And over the next 4 years, we'll be adding an additional $110 billion in new assets. It's important to note that these new assets are additive. They're not replacing older assets. So with a portfolio growing by such a significant amount, there is a huge amount of pressure that we are placing on our asset managers. In addition to this, we need to ensure that the infrastructure can be adapted to changing service needs, can provide continuity of service in the events of shocks and stresses, and are maintained in a safe and sustainable way. So there is a fair amount that we're asking government agencies to do, and to ensure the necessary change takes place, the whole of government asset management policy and assurance regime was introduced to put in place a standardised best practice approach right across the state. Next slide, please. So I'll now just talk through the different components of the policy to give everyone a sense of the type of approach that's being applied. So there are three core requirements of the policy. The first requirement is that agencies must align to 5 asset management principles. These principles align with those specified in ISO 55001, which is, of course, the international standard for asset management. So in complying with the policy, agencies will have in place an approach that aligns with good practice. I won't go through each principle, but what I do want to point out is that what we are trying to instill across government is a stewardship role over assets, where we take a whole of life cycle perspective and that our decisions are based on that right balance of cost, risk, and performance. The second requirement is that all government agencies have an effective data-backed asset management system. This includes asset management plans that contain the right evidence to support asset management decisions, including investment decisions. And lastly, the third core requirement is about accountability and transparency. The policy requires that the head of government departments annually attest to whether or not they are compliant with the policy. This ensures top-down support for the implementation and that the policy isn't just set and forgotten about. The next slide, please. So in recognising that climate change has and will continue to have a significant impact on infrastructure, we've included specific resilience provisions in the policy for government agencies to address. The first requirement recognises the interdependencies between different asset systems and that effective asset management must take a systems of systems approach. The second is that asset management plans must include an assessment of the resilience and vulnerability of assets to the impacts of climate change. And this requirement really reflects our view that good practice in asset management is intrinsically linked with climate resilient practice. So raising capability and maturity in this space is going to be critical. This is a relatively nascent area and there is definitely more work to be done. A key priority for us is to really explore how best we can help agencies apply resilient practice into how they do things, and the work we've done with the Resilient Cities Network and with Infrastructure Australia is really important in understanding, what are those next practical steps we can take to make meaningful change. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide, and what it's showing is that the outcomes being sought by the policy is very much about managing assets for the benefit of the community. So the first is about the capability of the public sector and lifting maturity and ensuring our workforce have the knowledge and are equipped with the right tools to effectively manage that growing asset base. The second is ensuring the resilience of assets so that we get as much economic social value as possible. Thirdly, that we are financially sustainable by ensuring we maintain long-term whole-of-life perspectives when we make asset management decisions. And lastly, to ensure that we are able to strike that right balance of risk, cost, and performance, we need robust data to really build that evidence base in order to make the right decisions. That's the end of the presentation. Nini, I'll hand back over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bopa and Kieran, for your wonderful presentation. And now we're moving to Beck for the local government perspective. Beck, the screen is yours.
Thanks very much, everyone. And I'm coming to you from Wongal country, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting today. Thanks very much. It's so fantastic to have all 3 layers of government who you can really start to see how from the top of the nation down through the region and now I guess from a city level, how we're really starting to think about how do we practically realise this kind of change that we need in the way that we understand and manage our assets in cities. So next slide, thanks. I'll just give you a quick overview of Resilient Sydney. Resilient Sydney's been running now for 7 years. We were originally a project out of the 100 Resilient Cities network, and obviously now a very key supporter of the Resilient Cities Network globally. We have a very small facilitating team that works with all the 33 metropolitan governments of metropolitan Sydney. So it's sort of a network of networks model for change. We have a range of different products and services now in the market. Our strategy was issued in 2018, and it's all available online. We have multiple, I think I would describe them as collaborations that are really trying to understand how local planning can understand and incentivize these sort of actions that we're talking about today. What's at risk locally for humans in a place really matters when we start to talk about which investments we should make in infrastructure in that place. But we haven't always done these things together. Next slide, thanks. In terms of the shocks and stresses for Sydney, we identified those using the Resilient Cities Network approach. And as you've heard from Kieran and Bofa and Rory, you know, the really big events that we've seen recently were all things that were in our list of shock events we identified that were likely for Sydney. I don't think any of us understood we'd have quite so many of them so quickly. So we've had every one of the major shock events that we identified in 2016 have now happened in the last 5 years. So the challenge of how we really rapidly shift our processes in government is very real and present. Next slide, thanks. In our resilience strategy, we had 5 key priorities or challenges that were identified in a major community engagement exercise across Sydney. And this is the way the community described what they thought resilience challenges were in our city. And lack of action adapting to heat and climate is one I'll just pick out. Obviously, also that disjointed governance and distrust. You can see today, I think the efforts of 5 years of really working across all the systems and the sectors, bringing together actors, and all of them really working at it too, enables us to now talk about delivery. Next slide, thanks. So, you know, going past that disjointed governance, we're really building the systems and structures to pull us all together. We've been really managing that risk in our city. So when we come to local government, we really worry about place and all the things that happen in that place. So we've been doing more local assessments of what those resilience challenges mean in a local context with the community, with businesses, and with obviously a council and its organisation and assets. That includes an internal review, and really what we're trying to get to is that all of our local governments understand what their resilience dividends would be if they made changes in their asset investments. And of course, as you can see, the scale of disruption we are getting in Australia means that when it comes to funding for assets, much of that funding is increasingly coming in recovery spend. So if our organisations can do some of this thinking in advance, the really main way many of them will make changes is through recovery spend. So instead of building back the same, they're building back with that resilience dividend in mind. And that's going to be true across the whole of our state for many of our local governments. So doing this work in advance sets us up to be ready to make those kinds of investments where we've done the thinking in advance. Next slide, thanks. I'm just going to quickly tell you about the project we've done as a set of collaborators. It's called Infrastructure for Resilient Places. I'll just acknowledge, you know, Infrastructure New South Wales and Resilient Cities Network have been really important partners in this project. We worked with AECOM, the consultant team, and it was supported generously by the City Foundation to deliver some of this work in Sydney. There's 2 outputs of the work where it's guidance for asset managers and an asset interdependency and resilience assessment tool. The job was to really say, what's all that stuff that's coming above us from the nation and from the state? How do we make that actually practically work on the ground? Next, thanks. So when we talk about those layers of interdependency or levels, it's really a tool to help local governments. It can be used in businesses or in asset managers, in the state agencies, at any level, to say, what is my asset connected to? What will matter if it goes wrong? What kind of flow-on impacts will change if this asset doesn't work or things go wrong with it in a shock event? And what's my priority with those actions or items? What do I care about at the community, the organisational level, and the asset level? Next slide, thanks. So the tool has a set of process steps, and this is an important piece with this work. I think it's not just always about the sitting in a corner with a spreadsheet. It's really about how we take all the organisation with us to understand why do we need to capture this information and how does it inform our decisions about assets. So the process enables you to look at those priority shocks, really think through what your risk statement is and think about the risk assessment for that particular issue. Look at mitigation actions. Understand what your dividends might be when you've done that. Once you've looked at that interdependency assessment, you can start to understand, if I change the outcome here, who will benefit? So what's the dividend for whom if I change the way my asset's going to work in a range of scenarios? And a process to track what you mitigate and how much money it might cost or what your return model might look like. And then obviously looking at things that you can't do now, but you might do later in a different context or with different funding available. Next slide, thanks. The little piece of magic that's in the back of this tool is just a consequence criteria that thinks about what the consequences are, not only at the asset level, but for the organisation that owns the asset or manages it, and for the community more broadly. So creating that criteria is helping people who are asset managers make those decisions more clearly because it gives them thresholds to make decisions about what matters to whom. Next slide, thanks. So the outputs of the process are really to help decision making about how do we get more resilient assets, and I think in this case, how do we get infrastructure and assets for resilience of the community. So the way we're describing it to people who are using the tool is that it really helps you to get on the front foot to manage and understand what your emerging risks might be. Take that place-based and community view. It clarifies the role of your assets or asset classes for the organisation and community, enables you to start to report that and describe it. And in a government context, it also is a process that captures the logic of the decisions that you've made, enables you to explain them to others in a way that perhaps we haven't been well versed to do yet. So it gives you an opportunity to think about those priorities of investments in a different way and look at those, recovery funding opportunities or funding opportunities that might come your way. And in the long run, the really big game is, of course, if we do this in every major region, like local governments and local areas across a state, then the state government and the federal government who've just spoken before us can then start to assess these across a region, but on a comparable basis. What matters to this community here and the way they manage their assets in this place might be quite different to another community, but the process enables the community and the local councils to make those decisions locally and push that information up through the process. So it starts to get a community-led approach to what really matters for resilience locally. Next slide, thanks. So now the approach is live. We've created this initial guidance. I think we would describe it as a really first step on this journey. We have a lot more work to do, but it's a great beginning. We are doing pilots with the state agencies and local councils here in Sydney and New South Wales, but we're also sharing our learnings more widely, and today's a good example with industry bodies, the private sector and global cities and others who are interested. Next slide, thanks. Thanks very much for the opportunity to have us all here today. It's been fantastic to see all the layers coming together, and we really hope we can share it with you and you might find it useful in your context. Thanks.
Thank you, Beck. And now I'm handing over to Madhu to guide us.
Thank you so much, Rory, Kieran, Bopa, and Beck, for your insightful and impressive work on infrastructure resilience in Australia. What I really liked is the very strong interlinkages that you all drew between assets, planning, and people. So now let's move on to our panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished panelists, Brian Strong and Monica Bennett. Brian Strong, as most of you know, is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of San Francisco. As the city's resilience officer and the director of the Office of Resilience and Capital Planning, Brian Strong is on the forefront of making San Francisco safe, sustainable, more equitable, and resilient far into the future. This includes overseeing the city's $39 billion capital plan and annual capital budget and its resilience program, including the Earthquake Safety Implementation Program, Lifelines Council, and Hazards and Climate Resilient Action Plan. Brian was also recently selected to sit on the National Advisory Council for FEMA and is a long-term appointee to the State of California's Integrated Climate and Resiliency Program Technical Advisory Committee. Brian has a master's degree in intergovernmental management from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College. Monica Bennett, our second panelist, is the Director of Thought Leadership at the Global Infrastructure Hub. Monica leads the development, delivery, and dissemination of the Global Infrastructure Hub's strategic and innovation-focused programs of work, including work streams on infratech, infrastructure futures, scaling up sustainable infrastructure investment, and transformative infrastructure post-COVID. Monica is a chartered chemical engineer and brings more than 18 years of experience in technology, innovation, and engineering consulting to the GI Hub team. So Brian and Monica, it would be great to hear from you some of your reflections on the work that has just been presented on Australia. And also it'll be great if you could also tie into some of your own work that you're doing at the city level and at the G20 level. And what do you see would be some of the challenges or some of the opportunities in mainstreaming infrastructure resilience? So first, let me hand it over to Brian. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. This is a great conversation and something I've been involved in for 15 years, I think, when I first started infrastructure planning for the city and county of San Francisco. And as Madhu mentioned, I've actually done work at the state level around this topic as well as at the federal level. So I appreciate how far things have come along, and I really love the kind of framework that the New South Wales, Sydney, and the Australian government are presenting here. It's refreshing in some ways to see that you're able to get all three bodies of government together to work on a project together. That is a rarity, I would say, in where I come from in the States. And again, I think it also sheds light on the complexity of this issue. One of our challenges that we really are facing, I think they can emphasize, is how do you align all these different bodies, right? We've been trying to think about levels of service for our communities and how infrastructure impacts those levels of service. But we have so many players, so many actors that are involved in the decision-making around, when the infrastructure should be developed, what should happen with it. And I've primarily focused on federal or government or city publicly owned infrastructure. Over 80% of the infrastructure in the United States is privately owned. So working on ways that we can begin to bring the private sector in a way that also recognizes equity and challenges around equity is one of the things that I would love to hear more from the panelists on. The other area I just wanted to mention is, I love the work around asset management and the focus on that and the need to look at life cycles. We recently released our climate action plan that had very aggressive retrofit targets for when we're going to get rid of greenhouse gases. And they talked about in San Francisco that all we needed to do was when we retrofitted all of our HVAC and building systems, we could just get rid of natural gas. The problem is that every one of those systems is already at the end of its useful life, or I should say maybe 90% of them are already at their useful life. So the idea that we can do it incrementally theoretically sounds good, but it doesn't really work that way. We really need large investments. And I think this follows up to sort of what Beck was mentioning. We're a city where we have seen a lot of these climate change impacts happen dramatically. Heat impacts, air quality impacts, those types of things for us, especially in San Francisco. And we really don't have I don't think there's the luxury to sort of wait long term to see if those investments come through. And that's how I'll end it. I guess I would just say is, the theory is great. I want to understand where the carrot is for jurisdictions and for communities to be able to do this. Building the trust is important, but where do we begin to see funding levels that communities have access to so they can actually implement some of these measures. So I will leave it at that. I'm sure I could talk more and more, but let me leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Brian. Those are some good food for thought, and probably we can bring that in during our Q&A session. Monica, over to you. Would love to hear your insights as well.
Thank you, Madhu, and thank you to the RCN and the World Bank for this opportunity to participate in this excellent conversation. So, like Brian, I really enjoyed hearing about the alignment on resilience between national, state, and local government. I guess the perspective that I bring is sort of another layer to this dialogue, which is the international priorities when it comes to infrastructure development, through the work that we're doing at the G20. So I guess, we've started at national, we've gone to local, and now we're kind of broadening out a bit to the G20 level. So it's probably just important to point out that, that our role at the G20 is to help bridge data and knowledge gaps and to advocate for change and infrastructure globally. And that's, obviously in response to key global challenges like COVID and social inequality and climate change. But as Brian mentioned, there is the challenge of this increasing investment gap that also needs to be addressed. And so I guess my response to the various presentations is really touching on 2 points. So the first is, this element of collaboration and coordination between a big range of stakeholders, but then also, the cost of disasters and the cost of inaction. And if we start with kind of that cost element, on the flip side, there is an opportunity. And, you mentioned, Madhu, what are the opportunities? So the opportunity is that, there's been a substantial amount of additional and accelerated infrastructure spending that's been announced in response to COVID. And, that's been at a global level. And, likewise, as Infrastructure New South Wales mentioned, there's also been a substantial amount of new investment, coming in future years. So, and so in 2020, we were actually asked by the G20 to examine this response to COVID. And what we found was around $3.2 trillion of additional or accelerated infrastructure investment is potentially going to be coming in over the next few years. And, noting that this is national infrastructure as a stimulus, so it doesn't even account for sort of subnational investment, which, for countries like the US and Australia is obviously, quite a substantial amount. But, to put this into context, this increases our annual infrastructure investment by 45% on an annual basis. So, to ensure that this infrastructure does not become a burden in terms of cost to the economy or cost to well-being, one of the things that we're advocating for is this achieving transformative outcomes through infrastructure. And I think a lot of the presenters had touched on this quite nicely. Looking at, directing this spending towards, specifically from our perspective, the 13 transformative outcomes and categories spanning environmental sustainability, resilience, digital, social, and R&D. I think that what we hope to see are innovative approaches and, innovative investments into new sectors and new transformative outcomes. And we have seen that come through. So, if we're looking at, what we've seen through the data that we've gathered over the last 12 months or so is that, more than 50% of this 3.2 trillion is going towards transformative outcomes. And, the top transformative outcomes include the likes of, low carbon transition, affordability, inclusive mobility, digitalization. And look, I won't go into too much detail on that. We have all that stuff on our website. But I guess, for all the Australians here, if anyone's interested, most of Australia's infrastructure as a stimulus is going towards transport. So, the economic outcomes in terms of transport, but then also interestingly, affordability. So looking at increasing affordability and access to digital infrastructure and through water investments as well, which is actually quite a unique segment that we've seen. So looking at this kind of opportunity, we have this opportunity to spend this kind of money, but how do we ensure that these investments actually flow to the right kinds of assets? And a big focus that we are looking at the moment is being able to bridge the investment gap. So having the money and having the money flowing to the right kinds of investments at speed and scale, because we have some very substantial targets to meet by 2030. And Including participation from the private sector is absolutely critical. So, but if you look at the gap in terms of investment, we're looking at a 5% of GDP gap to meet those targets. But if we look at the private investment into new infrastructure or into new investments, in 2020, it's only 0.2% of GDP. So there's a substantial gap that really needs to be bridged there. And also in terms of different sectors. But I might actually just stop there for now. There's also a lot that I could probably say on that topic, and I'm sure we can maybe cover it through Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica. So if I can invite all our speakers and presenters to come online. The points that Brian and Monica brought out is very interesting because as an urban planner, I struggle with it too, right? So I'm working in a lot of our client countries. So one question that that if I can pose on behalf of the panelists and what they were bringing out is this whole important area of equity. I really like that point that Brian raised because there are challenges to equity, right? So how are you in Australia trying to marry that with a broader goal of infrastructure resilience? That's my first question. And the second question that I think is also that Monica highlighted, which is also quite important, is how do we ensure recovery building is effective and resilient, right? So that also involves a lot of coordination across various infrastructure sectors, and we know often they don't speak to each other, right? So is there something within your plan from an implementation perspective that you're providing incentives to the various stakeholders to work together? Because that's often a big challenge between what I see are the national level goals versus local level implementation. So if you can speak to those two questions, we can get started on the Q&A. Thank you. So perhaps I can ask the federal government to come first, and then we can go down to the state and then to the local level.
Sure, I'll try to tap some of those loose ends. In terms of that equity question from the private sector, I think we have to look at benefit, accountability, and upskilling. So in terms of benefit, a lot of these resilience investments are inherently beneficial to private sector investors, particularly when you think about it in terms of stranded assets and in terms of building in the wrong floodplain or in a bushfire-prone area. So it's certainly within their own interest to do so. We've definitely seen a lot of movement in the sustainability sector and the built environment towards the private sector adopting standards which seem potentially above and beyond what is required, but is evidently in the best interests of sort of shareholders and the private sector themselves. In terms of accountability, our plan tries to sort of shine a light on everyone in the system and all of those levels which we specified. And that's to do with ensuring that there's the right data, ensuring that there's the right platforms to show when the private sector has a blind spot in terms of its community response. And in terms of upskilling, Kieran alluded to it earlier, that paper with regards to asset owners and operators' response to natural disasters and shocks and thrills is particularly relevant. And we found that speaking to those private sector investors, they're looking for guidance, and some of them are a bit lost. So the plan, again, can provide some of the guardrails which are required to kickstart some of the conversations around what is incredibly complex from an infrastructure perspective, in terms of all the sectors we govern. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks, Madhu. Look, I think, on that question around collaboration, nothing forces collaboration more than a disaster. And we've experienced that really recently with the floods right across New South Wales. So Infrastructure New South Wales, at the moment, we are in the thick of disaster recovery. So we're working right across the state, working with local government as well as state government, as well as with federal government to understand the quantum of impact and where we can allocate funds most effectively. It's a huge task. It's not easy, and it's really messy. At the moment, I think what's become really apparent is the necessity of data, and I've spoken about data and evidence during my presentation, and this sort of, the question around that gap and funding needs and how we address it, it really comes down to data, how you're able to articulate and put forward a compelling argument to invest in something. And And what's becoming really apparent is that for those very vulnerable areas that have been hit hardest by floods, where local councils, government agencies in those particular areas have low asset management maturity and low resilience maturity, they're not able to use any data that they might have or might not have. So we don't know the extent of damage. We can't quickly assess how much funding is needed when, you know, those questions are asked of us quite immediately and we need a response. So I think going forward, you know, our mission is really to build that capability and to build that maturity and to really understand what data we can effectively get people right across the state to start collecting, so that it informs decision making, so that the next time this happens, we don't have such a reactive approach. I mean, it's always going to be reactive, that's the nature of things. But if we could put some smarts behind our approach, I think that will make a really big difference.
Yeah, thanks. I think from a local government perspective, you know, the question that local government really needs to be asking itself and working through with the community is resilience for whom, which speaks to your equity question. You know, it is our view, certainly having done this process in Sydney and the region here, that we really need to do the process of walking with the community through identifying what those local vulnerabilities and stresses are, and having the conversation about what matters to them and what those priorities are locally. What that does in the context of those investments you're talking about is it effectively de-risks major investments coming forward from the state and from the federals and potentially also for the private sector, because we've done the work of saying what matters here to whom, who will benefit in what order, and you know, what's the, you know, priority, if you like, in terms of the way that money or that approach should be spent. You know, the only thing I will say about it is it's really hard to do quickly, and so it's straight after a disaster is a really difficult time to have that conversation with the community. It's much better to do it in advance, but it needs to be funded properly, and it's a process that you need to do in a longitudinal way, and for it to be renewed and taken up. And to me, that's the magic of the resilience strategies across cities that we see from Resilient Cities Network. You know what, it's really thankless in a whole range of ways. It's really back of house kind of really, you know, careful engagement work over a long period of time, but that's what de-risks these big projects and really builds the equity outcomes in from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Rory, Beck, and colleagues. So perhaps I can ask Brian and Monica to come back in with any last thoughts. I know we are coming close to the hour, but it'll be great to hear from you as well. And one area that I would have loved to hear more on, but of course we don't have enough time, is on the technology and how it's leapfrogging, right? And how we can use some of the technology also towards infrastructure resilience, but perhaps that can be a discussion for a future session. But over to you, Brian and Monica, for any last thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to Nini for the closing.
I'm happy to kick off, Brian, if that's okay. So,
Sure, go ahead.
I think just touching on the point around data is incredibly important, especially when you're looking at attracting, you know, the sort of magnitude of private sector investment that we're contemplating at the moment. So, and, you know, Beck, as you say, you know, having that kind of community engagement to understand, you know, what kind of infrastructure do we actually need to ensure resilience? You know, those kinds of, you know, definitions being defined at the community level is obviously incredibly important. You know, the conversations that we're having at the moment is defining a global standard for definitions around sustainable infrastructure. And so there's a bit of a gap between, you know, the direction in which, you know, private investors want to head in terms of, you know, definitions for sustainable infrastructure. And I guess, you know, how sustainable infrastructure is being defined at the project level as well. And so, you know, some of the work that we're doing is trying to find some kind of convergence or interoperability between, you know, the various ranges of definitions to kind of help, you know, give greater confidence that, you know, the investors aren't going to be investing in a stranded asset. It is going to be taken on. People are going to be using these public services. So that's one thing. And another thing is also around transparency, you know, looking at how, you know, the long-term pathways, I guess, to achieving those kinds of outcomes. And I think everybody, you know, in this in this discussion has already, taken steps towards that in terms of making those strategies visible. But, that was also another important element.
Yeah, I know we're just about out of time here. I would just say, I love that we've talked a lot about data, as we say usually in the US, and making sure it's actionable. So I mean, I can't tell you how many times we get data thrown upon us that doesn't really help us. And the community members don't want to keep getting asked questions that aren't really helping them. So it needs to be really actionable. I really underscore what Monica said about transparency. I was thinking about that a lot through this whole discussion. That helps with empowerment, helps build support, which you're going to need political support, as well as community support for these efforts. And then accountability. And I think this is an area that we really struggle with, which is, it's great to talk about how we can go to the community and get their feedback, but we really need accountability for, okay, who's going to take responsibility for making sure that what they hear gets implemented and that the resources sort of go in that direction. So that's, to me, that's the area that I'm really struggling with for this whole resilience question. It involves so many people that no one is able to really singularly take responsibility and accountability, and that's what we need. I'll pass it back to you, Madhu.
Thank you so much, all of you. This has been such a rich discussion. I wish we had more time because there are obviously a lot of questions that people have. But now that we've all connected, I hope people will reach out to you for some of your ideas and feedback. So with that, let me pass it on to Nini for the closing. Over to you, Nini.
Thank you, Madhu. And again, thank you so much for all the speakers and panelists. I know we can go for another hour, but unfortunately, I'm going to bring us to a close. I would like to remind everyone that the next session will be on the 21st of April. It will be back at 9 a.m. East Coast time and 9 p.m. Singapore time, and it will be on From Theory to Practice, Partnership Funding Resilience Implementation. So on behalf of the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank, we thank you for being here. Have a good evening, morning, afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you again for all the panelists. Bye-bye.